Hello, Blazers. Welcome to episode 129 of UAB Green and Told, original debut Monday, July 29th, 2024. This podcast gives us a chance to share stories from members of the UAB community. Take a listen back to past episodes of UAB's most downloaded podcast at alumni.uab.edu/greenandtold on Spotify or the Apple Podcast app. And while there, leave a written review so more alums can discover us. I'm Greg Berry, a UAB alum and Director of Communications in the Office of Alumni Affairs. Shakespeare once said, "It is not in the stars to hold our destiny, but in ourselves." While the Bard's quote holds plenty of truth, people can be guided or at least gently nudged towards certain paths. That's the case for today's guest, Groesbeck Parham. As we'll learn, medicine was a calling he accepted early on.
For some reason, they called me Little Doc. I could never get that out of my brain, and I think they programmed me from the time I was probably 4 or 5 years old to become a doctor.
Well, becoming a doctor was seemingly destiny. As he'll share, Groesbeck put the dominoes in place by watching others perform.
I mean, he was so graceful, the way he waltzed into the room and put on his gown and his gloves. And I just sat there and I said, man, I don't know what the hell this is, but whatever it is, that's what I want to be.
And now, years after obtaining his degree as a gynecologist, Groesbeck has gone global, experiencing medicine in some of the poorest and most remote places on Earth.
How in the world am I in a hospital in the middle of the Congo? Man, the Congo is rough. It is rough. It is rough.
For quite a while, Groesbeck Parham has had a global reach as a gynecologist. He's worked all across the world. And today, through his Friends of Africa nonprofit, he's working in places like the Congo, Malawi, and Rwanda. But everything he's doing now to help disadvantaged African women can trace its beginnings to Birmingham. From the time he was young, Groesbeck Parham was destined to become a doctor. It was just part of his questioning nature.
I was a pretty inquisitive kid, people tell me. Right? I was always investigating things, always looking for something different, something new. I like to tinker around with underneath automobiles, carburetors, and there were a lot of what we call jackleg mechanics in my community. So I'd hang out with them, play around with their cars. I had a great childhood. It was a good childhood.
I love the fact that you brought up tinkering with vehicles, working on cars, using your hands, because you'd become a doctor eventually. Did you know at that point that you wanted to go into medicine?
Had no idea. Now, there was one doctor, an MD in my town, but people called my father, he was a farmer, they called Doc, right? Because during that time, a lot of people could not afford to go to a physician into the hospital. So they would just come into the drugstore and give their complaints. And sometimes he would go in the back and just make up medicine. That's when everything wasn't in a pill. And he'd take his spatula and get out of this jar, something out of that bottle, and he'd make up some medicine. So they called him Dr. Parham. For some reason, they called me Little Doc. I could never get that out of my brain. And I think they programmed me from the time I was probably 4 or 5 years old to become a doctor. I really do.
You wound up leaving Birmingham to get your undergraduate education. Was UAB, was that even an option at that point?
No, the option was to get out of Birmingham. That's what the option was. Get out of here is, to be able to explore greater horizons, to meet new people, to see what life was all about outside of a place like Alabama. So, no, it was, I didn't apply. All the schools I applied for were outside of the state of Alabama.
But you would come back because you'd go to medical school. What went in that decision? Because at the time, it was a younger institution. It was just a fledgling UAB as we know it now. The medical school had been there for a while, but why coming back to Birmingham at that point?
I had finished college, graduated in 1970, had spent about 3 years just moving around the United States. My father became ill. And when I came back home, I visited him in the hospital. And for some reason, I asked him, I said, would you like for me to come back home? And back during those days, fathers didn't talk to children very much, right? They just look you in the eye. It was the mothers that talked to you all the time. And so he communicated to me that he would like for me to come back home. I came back and still didn't know what I wanted to do at that time. And I actually thought about going to nursing school.
Really?
Right? Yeah. So I went to UAB and started signing up for nursing school. And I got a job, a work study job in the Department of Biology with a wonderful professor of embryology named Gary Poirier. I worked in his lab. We go out on Fridays to a place called Ziggy's. I don't, it's been gone. It was a little piece of place. And one day he said to me, he said, "So you going to nursing school, huh?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "You finished this great university, Oberlin College." I said, "Yes." And he was a counselor for pre-med students, right? And he also wrote their letters of recommendations. You don't have confidence in your abilities, do you? And I didn't say anything. He said, "Let me tell you something. I watched you working around here for over a year." He said, "You have just as much gray matter or more gray matter than any of these guys that are coming in here for whom I'm writing letters of recommendation." So he says, "So there's a job in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology, and it's working for a gynecologic oncologist by the name of Hugh Shingleton." He said, I think it would be great if you met him, if you applied for that job, and if you surrounded yourself with doctors. And I think it would make you realize that this path you're on to go to nursing school is not your path. You should become a physician. So I started pre-med. Didn't really have a lot of confidence, probably because I was not good at mathematics. But there was this wonderful math lab at UAB. You didn't get any credit for it, but you could go in and you could self-teach. You could self-teach arithmetic, geometry, trigonometry, calculus. And I would go there every night, stay in that thing. I got over my fear of math. And then my wife convinced me that I could do math. And I said, "Well, I'm going to have to go back to arithmetic." She said, "Well, go back to arithmetic. Get your foundation together." And so I did that and applied to medical school and got in 1977.
What was medical school like back in the late 70s, early 80s?
Man, to me, it was tough. It was just rigorous. I was 7 years older than most of my classmates. I had a kid. I was married. I had been working around Birmingham and some of the steel mills and whatnot. So it was hard for me to get back into that discipline of studying, but I just studied all day, studied all night, studied all day, studied all night. I just went into it with reckless abandon, and I made it.
Do you think you put more into it than a lot of the other students?
Too much. If I could go back and do it again, I would study smarter, but I was so afraid that I wasn't gonna make it. They would lock me up in the library. I mean, the janitor knew me, and he would lock me up in the library, and I'd stay there in the morning sometimes. It was amazing.
What was the goal? Did you want to have a private practice and work as an OB-GYN?
I think maybe, like most people back then, probably not now, our goal was always to go into the community and provide service for the poor, for the downtrodden. That was, we all were service oriented. We were humanitarians back then. I think most people were, as opposed to some of the things that drive young kids today. But that's what I wanted to do. And then because I was working in the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology part-time, I kept that job while I was in medical school, that work study job. Dr. Shingleton took me to the operating room one day. He stopped by the lab. He said, "Would you like to go to the room?" I said, "Yes." So I went up and scrubbed in and watched him do this complicated surgery. I didn't know what he was doing at the time, but he was so graceful, the way he waltzed into the room and put on his gown and his gloves. And I just sat there and I said, "Man, I don't know what the hell this is, but whatever it is, that's what I want to be. And I didn't know anything about GYN oncology. It was just the man himself, his grace, his hands, the way he moved. And I guess that goes back to tinkering, right? I watched his hands. So we became great friends. He taught me how to do research, how to write papers. He would take me on some trips to make presentations where people would just kill me from the audience asking questions, right? Because I was just a young student. So it was it was meeting him that made me expand my horizons, and he was always inviting people from other parts of the world to UAB. He always said, people think because we are Southerners that we're just dumb bumpkins. He said, I want to show them that that's not the case. I did ob-gyn residency here at UAB under Dr. Charles Flowers, and then completed my residency. Dr. Shingen had introduced me to a surgeon in London, and he financed me to take my family to London, and we lived in London. My kids were 8 and 10. They went to school in London. This is the greatest year we ever had as a family. We talk about it all the time.
Adventure has been kind of a recurring thing for you, wanting to get out and branch away. Let's focus on that experience in London. What was it like, and how did it just kind of introduce you to a global perspective?
That was something. You know, London sits in a place where you can catch trains and get on boats. And we used to go to Brussels. We went to Paris, and you know, almost every other weekend we were traveling somewhere. Broke as hell, man. We charged everything up. When we got back to the States, we owed so much money. It was crazy, but we loved it. And we met people from all over the globe. London is very, very, very cosmopolitan. That was really an experience that expanded all of us. And one key thing about that experience in London is that I met a student, guy from Khartoum, big African country, you know, in Central Africa, and he was studying orthopedic surgery. And so we became friends. We go out on the weekends, drink a beer or something. And once he said to me, he said, so you're here studying with this world-renowned urogynecologist, you know, urological problems in women. He said, if you really want to know what it's like to study urogynecology, you need to go to my country, Sudan. And these were his words. He said, where people live as close to the ground as animals. These were his words. So it turned out that the guy under whom I was studying in London was friends with this doctor in Sudan. He was a world-renowned fistula surgeon. You know, these holes that develop between women's bladders and vaginas and rectums and vaginas when they're in labor, and the baby's heads get stuck in the pelvis, get stuck in the vagina, and it puts a lot of pressure on the pelvic organs. The babies usually die, and when they are eventually delivered, these areas in the pelvis turn gangrene, and they just open up these holes. So urine and feces is just flowing through the vagina. This guy in the Sudan had a hospital just to repair those defects. I asked my mentee in London, could I cut my time with him short and go to Sudan and spend 3 months working with this doctor? And he said yes. And I wrote the doctor in Sudan, and he said, come. And again, we bought these plane tickets from, I don't know, Bulgarian Airlines, stayed in the airport for 24 hours once, and got there and lived in Africa. That was our first experience in Africa for 3 months, and worked with this physician. And it was the first time I'd ever really seen anybody work with almost nothing, right? He barely had suture material. His instruments were old. He put people to sleep using ether. The floors in the operating room were made of dirt. Sometimes the electricity would go out, and we'd have to pick the operating room table up with the patient on it and move it over to the window, operate by sunlight. And I was really impressed.
Wow.
And one day in this operating room, they were operating on a patient, and they had this big mass in the abdomen. and the bowel intestine was all stuck. And he turned and looked at me and he said, "Can you remove this?" I said, "I don't have the skills to do that." And so they closed her up. And so the day I left Sudan, he looked at me and this is what he said. He said, "You're like a stray dog going from door to door looking for a home." He said, "Africa is your home." He said, and I think you're going to come back one day and I think you're going to make a great contribution." He said, "But don't come back until you have developed some skills that we don't have here." Got in his Mercedes and left. And that always stuck with me. His name was Dr. Hassan Abo.
When was that first trip to Africa, to Sudan?
1986.
1986.
Yeah. And when I got back to the U.S., I then started my GYN oncology fellowship at the University of California.
You mentioned it was the first trip to Africa. You would return. Was the first time you returned when you went back to Zambia, or did you make trips between then and then founding the cervical cancer prevention program in Zambia?
I made a lot of trips back to Africa, mostly South, right? Because a lot of things were happening there. Nelson Mandela had been freed from prison, and so the interest was there. Actually, I went back to Africa before he was freed, so I really had a chance to see South African apartheid, right? And the dogs going through the airport and the Gestapo, et cetera. But I went going back to South Africa, and I was trying to establish cervical cancer screening program there. At the time, apartheid had just ended, so the South Africans really were intent on doing things themselves.
Sure.
They really didn't want anybody else from another part of the world coming in trying to help them. And I understood that. Growing up in the 60s, I understood, you get to a point and you say, I can do this myself. And so it didn't work there. But I met great friends there, had a lot of experience working, in operating rooms, but the program never really took off there.
Then why Zambia?
Once I completed my gynecologic oncology training, I worked in Los Angeles for about 5 years, worked in Little Rock, Arkansas for about 8 years, and eventually came back to Birmingham because my mother was ill. She had developed Alzheimer's. And so we came back to Birmingham, and I worked with Ed Partridge in the Department of OB-GYN with this Deep South Network program. Spent a lot of time in the Mississippi Delta and the Alabama Black Belt. And for some reason, I had this itch to go back to Africa. It just wouldn't stop. And someone at UAB introduced me to a young doctor who was working at UAB, but he and his wife had gone to Zambia to develop an HIV treatment program. HIV was just ravaged just all across the continent at that time. And so I went. He invited me. I went and went to the university and made what we call rounds. I went to the gynecology floor, and there was just tons of women there in their 20s and 30s with cancer of the cervix. And they were all HIV positive. Because cancer of the cervix in the United States is something you see in women in their late 40s and 50s and 60s. This was different. This was in women in their 20s and 30s, and it was because they were infected with HIV. And when women, and HIV causes a rapid proliferation of cervical cancer from this virus that causes cervical cancer, HPV. So you see it in women in their 20s and 30s. Most of these women were going to die. There was no radiation treatment. No one knew how to do the surgery to treat women who had cervical cancer. And I asked them if they were doing any cervical cancer screening, and they said no.
Wow.
And I knew that was my spot. Came back home, talked to my wife about it, started working with Mike Sag. I had moved from OB-GYN to Mike Sag's department. And Mike helped me get some money to go to Zambia, a small amount of money. But I went, and my wife was extremely supportive. And I had no idea how I was going to do this thing. But my wife gave me a a saying by this old British Pentecostal minister. His name was Smith Wigglesworth. And it said something like, I'm not moved by what I see. I'm not moved by what I feel. I'm only moved by what I believe. And I was laying on my mother's sofa. And as I was going to sleep, I said, this is the prayer I said, God, if you take me and put me in a place in the world where I can serve the most dispossessed women on the planet, I promise you I will go and I'll stay until you tell me to go back, come home. That was 2003. And a few months later, SAG came up with some money. And a few months later, I was in Africa, I was in Zambia and started developing the cervical cancer program. And it later became the largest cervical cancer screening program on the continent of Africa. George Bush invested a lot of money in it in 2011. We had like $70,000 a year to try to screen women. And when he came and saw it, he dropped about $4 million on us, and we almost went crazy. We started expanding and training more nurses, training more doctors. And he came back in 2012, 2013 to even help build clinics. He was painting, and he's crazy, man. He's a great guy. He brought his wife and he brought corporate executives. And I remember being on the stage one time with the President Bush, his wife, the ambassador to the U.S. ambassador to Zambia, the first lady, the president's wife of Zambia. And I reflected back on how this whole thing started. And it was just, it was a miracle, right? It had to be spiritual. And so we started screening, and then the program became so successful that the government incorporated it, adopted it, and incorporated it as that national cervical cancer screening program in 2015.
Wow.
Unheard of.
Wow. So over the, dozen or so years before 2015, how often were you going Birmingham, Zambia? You had to have been going back and forth all the time.
Yeah, I would every 6 months or so, I'd come home for 2 or 3 weeks and I'd go back, just whenever I could find money to come home. My wife made a great sacrifice, man, because I was away a lot. But that's what it took. And then eventually she joined me and decided to come to Africa and live with me. And that's when we started living full time. But I've spent most of my time there from 2005 on. So it's been almost 20 years. But it was back and forth for a few years. And then we finally decided just to go to Zambia and just throw down our gauntlet and make that our place where we would live for the rest of our lives. And so we started training other people from other African countries. They would come to Zambia because we had this model of how to train nurses, because there were not enough doctors. So we were training nurses to do what doctors usually do in the United States, to treat cervical precancer. And it just went all over the continent.
You were with the CCPPZ for, a dozen so years. The government absorbed it. They took over it. But that didn't end your foray in Africa, because you're now part of Friends of Africa, where you serve as CEO. Talk about that program and what it's doing for that continent.
So Friends of Africa is a 501c3. It's a nonprofit that I started when I came back home from Khartoum, Sudan. And I used it to raise money to give to Dr. Abu to build a new fistula hospital. But since that time, we've used it to raise money to train doctors and nurses from other parts of Africa to detect and treat cervical cancer. And most lately, we've been doing it, we've added breast cancer, right? And so, but then there are these other cancers of the uterus, cancers of the vulva, that's the tissue on the outside of the woman's private parts, and then cancer of the ovaries. Those cancers are increasing as the lifestyle changes to a more Western lifestyle. And some of those cancer of the vulva is associated with HIV, like cancer of the cervix. It grows faster. So we've been raising money to go to different countries to train those doctors and nurses how to screen and treat cervical and breast cancer. One big program we did was in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in a private hospital owned by the NBA player, Dikembe Mutombo.
Sure.
He's a great guy, angel. And so we went into his hospital, trained his staff, and they've been rocking and rolling since we left. We've done work in Sierra Leone, in Malawi, and we're also doing some work now in the country of Rwanda, which is in East Africa. So we raise funds, and donors, give us the money, and we report back what we're doing. So this is the organ now that we use to do our work in other African nations, to train people. Because what we're trying to, we feel like we've developed a model. It's a good model. It works in a low resource environment, doesn't require a lot of technology, a lot of hands-on, human effort, but it is sustainable in those environments. And so we want to continue to spread, to clone the model, so to speak, because it works.
Where can listeners help? Where can they donate?
Listeners can donate. They can go to our website, thefriendsofafrica.org. And when you get to that website, you'll see where it says donate. And you can either send a check, or you can donate through PayPal, or you can write me and tell me how you want to donate. My email is professorparham@gmail.com.
And I'll include that in the show notes. Looking back as little Doc, way back when, do you think you'd have the impact that you did today?
I had no idea, man. I was just following the pathless path, and that's what it was. People always say, and I now understand it, it's not the goal, it's the process. And if you get into the process and really believe in what you're doing and understand that it's really not you, that it's a higher spiritual force that's guiding you, then you keep moving and you look around and you say, how in the world am I sitting on a stage with President George Bush and his wife and the ambassador from the United States? How in the world am I in a hospital in the middle of the Congo? Man, the Congo is rough. It is rough. It is rough. And so you're being led by the Spirit, right? And so, no, I had no idea, but I guess it was my fearlessness and going back to Fairfield, watching people make something out of nothing. My father started his pharmacy in 1935, right after the Depression, with 50 cents in the cash register and a bottle of castor oil on the shelf.
Wow.
He ran that store for 40 years, man. 40 years. 7 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock at night, 7 days a week. That was a hard working class ethic. And those guys had come up from rural Alabama in deep poverty, and they were not looking back. So I had no idea, but I had that ethic, and I had seen people make something nothing. So I knew it could be done.
That's Groesbeck Parham. Dr. Parham earned his Doctor of Medicine from UAB's Heersink School of Medicine in 1981 before completing his residency in obstetrics and gynecology in 1985. Today, he is a senior clinical expert for the World Health Organization and CEO of Friends of Africa. Groesbeck's knowledge has truly helped change the world, and he has a great grasp of what it means to be a Blazer.
It means that I am a son of Alabama, that I'm a representative of UAB wherever I go. I carry that brand on my back, right? And so I'm very proud of it. I embrace University of Alabama in Birmingham. And so it gave me an opportunity to acquire some skills and move forward in the world where I never would have been able to do it without that opportunity. So that's what it means to me. Opportunity and education, skill development, and something I'm very proud of.
Be sure to check out past episodes of the UAB Green and Told podcast. Listen in at alumni.uab.edu/greenandtold. Have a story to share or know someone who does? Email greenandtold@uab.edu. Finally, be sure to follow us on social media. Just search UAB Alumni on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for listening, and until next time, go Blazers.